Hello and welcome to Euranet Plus Press Club debate. Just yesterday on Wednesday, European Commission proposed a 750 billion euro economic recovery package called Next Generation EU. It is bigger than many have expected, and out of this amount, 500 billion euros are to be distributed as grants. So the money that doesn't have to be given back right away or in the exact same amount. But does it have a chance to survive the resistance of so-called frugal member states? This is the topic of today's conversation, and with me I have an excellent panel of four guests, great journalists from all over Europe. Gigi Donnelly from Radio 24 in Italy, Anina Luutanen from the Finnish news agency STT, Andreas Liliheyden from Swedish Radio, Florian Eder from Politico, and my name is Artem Skonhas. Florian, I want to begin with you. Let's start by this sort of a broad look on this issue, since you've been covering this from, let's say, a more European rather than a national perspective. As far as I understand, many have expected the European Commission would divide 500 billion euros into this grants and loans, but instead they decided to give all of that as grants. Were you surprised when you heard that?
Well, you said at the beginning that the package is surprisingly big. I would say, as we all know, this is a proposal by the European Commission. And if you want, this proposal to move into a result and a compromise, then of course you have to propose something bigger so that national leaders can shrink it down a little bit. So I was not super surprised. It sounded somehow natural that you, from another point of view, that the Commission, proposes a figure of its own and does not just take something that was put on the table last week by German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the French President Emmanuel Macron, the 500 billion euros that they proposed as a recovery fund, but the Commission adds their own view and its own, kind of approach to this thing. So I wasn't terribly surprised, but of course, what needs to be said is that we are all dealing with, incredibly high numbers that nobody would have ever dreamt of a year ago or even a few months ago, that the EU would kind of hand out to its members. This is really a fully blown, fully fledged crisis mode, and this is a huge amount of money. Let's not forget that.
It is indeed. So you're, I guess, one of the people who then says that this amount is likely to shrink. What's the direction? Do you think the South will get less, or someone else will have, or there will be more loans rather than grants? What's your prediction?
I mean, that loans versus grants thing is an interesting one. Of course, there's that's one leverage that you can take and move it a little bit left or right. That is, of course, likely to happen, and it's an easy thing to do. On the other hand, this is it's very interesting approach to always talk about grants as something that the EU hands out and that member states do not need to pay back. It is, of course, if you look at it from the Commission's point of view, probably you would rather say this is expenditure, as every national state would just make it for things that that the government and the parliament reckon is important. So if we move into that direction, that is of course more than just giving out money. It's a philosophical change in how we look at the European budget. So I wonder whether that kind of approach survives the next rounds of negotiation in the European Council. And the other thing is, as you said just briefly, there are of course 3 or 4 different camps. The South wants as much money as they can get, as the Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz put it in an interview with Politico yesterday. The East and the Central and Eastern European countries want to prevent as much money from going southwards as they can. And then there's, again, I'm just quoting Sebastian Kurz, then there's the camp of those who are paying the whole party. They want to spend they don't want to spend money, or they want to contain the amount of money that they need to spend. So at some point in the middle is probably, to be honest, that German-French proposal that will be probably a kind of, I would say, a kind of landing zone for leaders.
Gigi, I want to move to you now because obviously Italy is the big recipient of this proposal. Together, Italy and Spain are getting something roughly around 40% of the total amount of money. And Italy, of course, has been very much in the center of this whole debate. What do the officials in Rome are saying about it? Are they happy with what is being proposed, or are they still skeptical about, let's say, some conditions that are not really conditions and a sort of similar kind of problems that might be there?
Well, I think the first answer is yes. Italy is very satisfied for the amount of money because, of course, numbers count. But also, as European Affairs Minister Amendola immediately said, is because Europe is there. The feeling that finally there is a different approach that is moving up, that of course people understand very well the role of Germany in this, let's say, frame. And the fact that, as Florence said, I think it's perfectly right. I mean, the numbers are really huge, and maybe they will be changed, and probably has to be changed during the debate. But still, this first reaction is really strong. So Europe is there. Of course, from a more political and governmental approach, our Prime Minister Conte has to be very satisfied because, as he said, he's basically, well, he talked about an excellent signal from Brussels, which goes right in the direction indicated by Italy. So, of course, he's very happy. There is also a story, which is personally by Giuseppe Conte in the role that he had during this debate and fragility, political internal fragility on one side, and the strength that he's getting from his European dimension. So yes, and of course there are many skepticals from the opposition party, and not only from the opposition party, by the fact that still are proposals. So the road is still long to go.
One thing that Commission is saying that there needs to be a reform plan. So there needs to be a clear something that the money, clear aim where the money is going to be spent. And other countries also need to agree. So in some way we can call it conditions or conditionality, which has been a taboo for Italy for a long time in this debate. So is this making some of the politicians vary about the kind of reforms that Brussels might ask or the other member states might be pushing for?
I think the very large majority of Italians is has perfectly clear in mind that our country, probably not only our country, but sure our country needs important reform. So that is not a shock, it's not an offense. And the conditionality, as correctly you talk about, was a very basically a political issue. I mean, we are used, any normal people knows that there are conditionality when you ask for money. It became a very much inflammable subject because of the role of Salvini and let's say the opposition, not even all the opposition, because for example, Silvio Berlusconi was very quiet in accusing Europe on this kind of conditionality. So it's a part of the story. Reforms are very needed. And the widens of this request, I mean, the European Commission is talking about reform in health, industrial, education, green economy, more or less everything. So that cannot be something that scare a country or another.
Andreas, I want to move now to Sweden. You come from a country that belongs to the Frugal Four and is one of those who, as Florian has been quoting the Chancellor of Austria, Sebastian Kurz, will have to pay for the party. So what's the reactions there? From what I read, it seems to be that there is not such a strong opposition as it was before to the whole idea of necessity to pay the money and also for a somewhat larger multi-annual financial framework. Am I understanding this right?
I would say that in Sweden, the position hasn't really changed. Maybe in some of the other frugal countries, but in Sweden, the position is basically the same. They don't want to pay more into the European budget, and when it comes to the recovery fund, Sweden has said before and is still saying that there shouldn't be any grants at all. This should only be loans. And I mean, the Swedish government, they do want to help countries like Italy and Spain, and they do realize that yes, Sweden is a small country, highly dependent on exports, and it's very important that the single market in the EU works, and it works for Sweden. But still, they don't want to see any grants at all. And I think that you have to also understand maybe the political situation in Sweden. Sweden is run by a minority government with passive support from two opposition parties. And basically no party whatsoever in Sweden wants to give more money to the EU. And no one wants to give anything else but loans to countries in need. And of course, Sweden does need approval from the national parliament to be able to approve this on EU level. And if I look at the proposal from the Commission yesterday, this will be extremely difficult to sell in the Swedish parliament. So from a Swedish point of view, there has to be some changes. And like one official told me, we did talk about the conditions for grants or loans, and that is very important for the Swedish government. One official told me yesterday that, we don't want to put 80 billion euros in a black hole in Italy. That's what they told me. So there must be demands for reforms so that you can actually see that this money that will come partly from Sweden, that it will actually have an effect.
So we're going back, let's say, to the same kind of conditions and the reform plan that we were just discussing with Gigi on this. Are there any kind of indications from your sources, from what you hear about the type of sort of a plan or the conditions that Sweden might want to see, or more generally, the type of concessions, just besides this division between grants and loans, that might persuade the Swedish government, or would help, let's say, the Swedish public, the Swedish politicians to sell this to the public?
I think that in terms of conditions, I haven't heard any details, and I think that the government would be very careful of point at Italy, for instance, and say you should do this specific reform. I think it's more a general point of view that when you give money, there has to be conditions, and also that these conditions actually makes the country work better in economic terms, which will also benefit Sweden, of course, and the European market. But there is one thing that the government was quite unhappy with yesterday, and it was the explanation or the analysis from the European Commission how big are the needs for support. The Swedish government had been saying before that before we talk any money at all, we need to have a detail and a clear view of how much money is actually needed. And they weren't at all happy with the working paper from the Commission with this analysis. So they, as I understood it, they will ask for more details on what are actually the needs in European countries, and then we can talk about the money that we're going to give to support these countries.
Now let's move to Finland, stay in the north for a moment. Anina, Finland has been siding mostly with the Frugal Four, not as vocally as some others, but still it has been on the side of like not spending or not giving the EU budget too much more money compared to what has already been given or been given before. But lately, Sanna Marin, your prime minister, has been changing her stance at least a little. Why so?
I haven't really heard a good explanation why Finland didn't join the open letter of the Frugal Four countries. What I know this far is that Finland hasn't decided its final stance on the package yet. It's still exploring the details and making some calculus. How does it affect Finland? How much would it pay? How much would it get? And then they will decide the final stance. What I know already is that this question that many of you raised, the large share of grants, it's also a problem for Finland. They had pushed for a larger share of loans instead. The Minister of European Affairs, Tytti Tuppurainen, said yesterday that, however, she's quite happy with the fact that the money is delivered to the countries via MFF, because it means that political principles are followed, those political principles that 27 countries have agreed together. A big question still remains what this conditionality means. It's also a big question for Finland.
The Eurosceptics in Finland has already been saying that instead of participating in this plan, instead Finland should prepare for the exit of the Eurozone. But we also know, of course, that the countries that are not part of the Eurozone are participating in this. So how popular is this belief in this sort of ideas of Euroscepticism now and during this crisis in Finland?
Indeed, they said this idea of leaving euro area again. There is nothing new in it. They have said it even before the Finns party. I think this has been heard in other populistic parties in other parts of Europe as well. It's interesting to see how the popularity of the Finns party will evolve when the question begins to make some rounds in Finnish discussion. At the moment, during the corona crisis, they have lost some ground in the polls as anywhere else. Also in Finland, the Prime Minister party, Social Democrats, has gained, and the Prime Minister is very popular and trusted.
Since you mentioned Social Democrats, I can't stop myself but to ask the question about the social democracy in this regard, because both Sweden and Finland is now governed by the Social Democrats, who are in the same political family as, let's say, Pedro Sanchez in Spain. But the debate and discussions seems to be quite different in the tone. Is the social democracy somehow very different in the north than in the south? Anina?
If you ask me, yeah, indeed. Well, it's a good question. I think political parties, they are the offspring of national circumstances, national history. So I don't really know. I think the European identity in Finland hasn't evolved as much as it has in Spain, because they have been members much longer than Finland. But I don't really know, does the political party play such a big role in this sense?
Andreas, do you have anything to add on this, Vijay?
Yeah, I think that, well, I would agree with Anina that also in Sweden, we don't have a really great sense of maybe being Europeans, but rather Swedish people. I think it was quite interesting. I saw a tweet recently from the Swedish Prime Minister when he had a talk with Antonio Costa in Portugal, who's also from the same European party. And basically the message from the Swedish Prime Minister was that, yeah, we need to agree. It's important that we stay united in Europe. But I thought it was quite funny, because we all know that these two prime ministers, they are very far apart on the most crucial issue for the moment. So it's yes, they do belong to the same European political family, but I think in the end of the day, it's the national politics that matters for politicians mainly.
Florian, you wanted to add something, I guess.
No, just this is not just this is not just true for social democracy. Look at the other European party families. Renew Europe, the Liberals, for example. There's a huge difference between Emmanuel Macron and Mark Rutte, and we've seen that from the very beginning. And the same for the EPP, the European Christian Democrats, where you have people like Kyriakos Mitsotakis in Greece, who is of course aligned with the South on this, and there's people like the aforementioned Sebastian Kurz, for example, of Austria. So I think this is one more. It's not just this COVID-19 opportunity, but any occasion where we talk about money in Brussels, it is very clear that the concept of European party families is something for times of European campaigns, and in other times just something for the Brussels bubble, but has no significance really in the daily life of European leaders.
Speaking of Germany, since Florian, you come from Germany yourself, some say that Germany only came up with this Franco-German proposal of 500 billion because it wanted to somehow improve its reputation after the judgment of the Constitutional Court. And others are also saying that this kind of architecture of this plan, in fact, might be very difficult to sell in Bundestag, and it might also be questioned by the Constitutional Court in a few years. Do you see it coming?
Well, it is very kind of people to think that Chancellor Merkel and Germans in general would be impressed by public opinion in other countries. I don't really think so at all. That this is nothing that was a short-term reaction to the Bundesverfassungsgericht's ruling some weeks ago. I think this is truly an occasion and an opportunity where the Chancellor Angela Merkel thought she could, and she was in a position to move a little bit here and there and to kind of find a compromise with France, which is something that has, it took her a few years, let's say 3, 4 even, after the first attempt of Emmanuel Macron. She now is in a position to move, and Emmanuel Macron, if you look at it like that, was actually forced to move and to accept some things that he would probably not have accepted a few weeks ago as the conditionality or sort of conditionality that we talked about before and stuff like that. So I think it is maybe Angela Merkel's occasion to look a little bit after her own legacy. We all know that she has said that she will not run again when this term is over, the autumn of next year. But I do not think that this is a short-term reaction to any kind of public opinion elsewhere.
Indeed. So unfortunately, we are running out of time. There would be so much more to discuss in this conversation. Thank you very much for joining. This is all we had time for today. This was the Euranet Plus Press Club debate, and see you next time.